Okay, good morning and a very warm welcome to everyone to this open lecture, which I believe is the first of today. This is being held as part of the Communities Week during our inaugural Brunel Research Festival. So a lot of excitement for all of us here. My name is Liana Chua. I'm a reader in anthropology and I'm going to be chairing this session today. And today I'm really happy to welcome one of my colleagues, Dr. Viola Schreer, who's coming in all the way from Germany on the screen, who works with me as part of a larger project that I lead here at Brunel on the global network of orangutan conservation. Now, Viola is a social anthropologist. She's got long-term ethnographic interests in Indonesian Borneo and specifically in the province of Central Kalimantan, where she's worked on human-environment relations, livelihoods, hope, development, and also conservation since about 2010, if I'm not mistaken, Viola. Thereabouts, a long time anyway. Viola received her PhD in anthropology from the School of Anthropology and Conservation at the University of Kent. And since 2018, when she joined our project, she's been exploring the intersections, often messy intersections, between orangutans and rural communities and conservationists in the context of a recently set up community conservation scheme in Indonesian Borneo. And so today she's going to tell us a little bit about some of the things that she's found during her recent research with this area. So I'm now going to hand things over to Viola, and at the end of the talk, we'll hopefully have a little bit of time for question and answer and discussion. So Viola, over to you.
Okay, good morning and welcome everybody, and thanks so much for this lovely introduction, Liana, and also thanks so much for Melvis for giving me the opportunity to share my research here with the wider public as part of this Brunel Research Festival. As Liana already outlined, I'm a social anthropologist, and for the last 12 years, I've been doing research on an indigenous Dayak Ngaju communities at the edge of the Indonesian Borneo rainforest on the island of Borneo, and their ways of making a living under dramatic socioeconomic and environmental changes due to capitalist, often state-led development initiatives, such as logging, palm oil expansion, and infrastructure development. And while most of my research has been dedicated to exploring local people's relationship with these various forces, as Liana mentioned, since 2018, I've begun to study their relationship with yet another actor of Borneo that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and that you can see here. That is the orangutan. It's actually, this picture was taken in 2009, and it's the only orangutan I sort of encountered in the wild since I've been in Borneo. So, as Liana said, I'm part of the Global Lives of the Orangutan project that is led by Liana, and studies different aspects of orangutan conservation around the globe. Liana investigates how orangutans are visualized in different conservation contexts. Hannah Fair explores virtually orangutan adoption schemes run mainly by charities in the global north. Anna Stipien studies human orangutan conflict mitigation and rescue in Sumatra, and I explore community conservation efforts in Indonesian Borneo that seek to convince local villagers of the need to protect orangutans and the wider idea of conservation. And our project also works closely together with Paul Sang of POCOC, which is another project led by Liana that investigates orangutan killing in Borneo. And I want to say that a lot of the things that I share today and my analysis has benefited a lot from my discussions with my lovely colleagues, but also with my friends and colleagues in Indonesian Borneo. And while we have found many interesting things, I think there are two interrelated aspects of orangutan conservation that are particularly striking and also crucial for orangutan conservation itself, and that have inspired today's talk and my overall analysis of the ways in which orangutan conservation works. The first thing is the highly different way in which people perceive and relate to orangutans in the global north compared to rural villages living alongside orangutans in Borneo and Sumatra, where orangutans often have little meaning. This in turn had also repercussions for my fieldwork in a Bornean village, where I had come to study an orangutan community conservation project. Yet, as orangutans hardly played any role in people's everyday life, I began to question what I was actually doing here and how I should study orangutan conservation without orangutans. And it's this puzzle that I want to address and unpack today. So let me start with a little ethnographic vignette that takes you to a small upland village in the interior of Borneo, where I had the following conversation with my adopted uncle Yusuf on a day in November 2019. And I should say that in 2013, I already, as part of my PhD research, stayed for a very long time in this village. Yusuf asked, "For what are they releasing orangutans here? What's the meaning of all this?" Yusuf asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't know, uncle. You need to ask the people of the NGO," I answered, not really knowing what to say. A few months ago, a conservation organization had begun to release rehabilitant orangutans in a national park bordering Saipan village, a small upland settlement of 250 people in Indonesian Borneo. The village still lacked running water, electricity, basic healthcare, and communication facilities. Like Yusuf, most inhabitants of Saipan struggled to make sense of the release and could not understand the care and money invested in saving the ape. Orangutans had little meaning for the villagers. Not seen as particularly special and hardly encountered, orangutans were virtually absent in people's everyday life. Yet Yusuf continued complaining, quote, "Since they started releasing orangutans here, things have become sick, pehe, in the local language." While pehe literally refers to the physical experience of being sick or a body part feeling sore or in pain, figuratively, it is a catch-all for people's worries, anxieties, and frustrations due to a precarious socioeconomic situation. It seemed that in the wake of the release activities, orangutans had turned from an irrelevant being into a powerful actor impacting on village affairs in various adverse manners. In the following, I wish to explore the relationship between orangutans and Bornean villages like Yusuf by investigating the complex, often unseen ways in which orangutans become present in these people's lives thanks to the work of conservation interventions. Thinking through questions of absence and presence within one global conservation nexus, I offer the figure of the orangutan as absent agent to problematize a common phenomenon across international biodiversity conservation. To mobilize moral, financial, and political support for the cause of conservation, organizations from the global north strategically popularize so-called flagship species, to elephants, tigers, polar bears, or orangutans, that however often have little or very different meaning for the people living next to or with these species in the global south, yet that come to influence their lives in diverse ways due to the efforts of conservationists who are trying to save these species from extinction. While the conservation literature has intensively discussed whether it is appropriate and effective to use such flagship species as marketing tool, the ways in which flagship species act and impact on conservation initiatives remain, however, poorly understood. By proposing the figure of the orangutan as absent agent, I seek to expand and nuance our understanding of such flagship species action. I do so by drawing on anthropological and sociological research that has shown how things, people, and phenomena matter, even though they are not there in a physical sense. Although today I won't go into further detail about this literature, I just wanted to mention it to you. I suggest that the orangutan is there, acts and influences because it affects a relationship between local villages and conservationists in which the ape itself is, however, largely absent. This relationship is mediated through a broad range of activities, measures, and interventions whose overall goal is to change people's attitudes and behavior towards orangutans and the environment more broadly. While these activities thus aim at making the orangutan so present, they rarely succeed. I suggest that this is mainly due to the different understandings and expectations that villages and conservation organizations have about the modalities of their relationship. With the figure of the orangutan as absent agent, I wish not only to give insight in the ways in which orangutan conservation works or not, but reveal some of the great disparities, inequalities, and imbalances existing within orangutan conservation and global conservation at large. There are 3 species of orangutans, namely Pongo abeliae and Pongo tabaliniensis in Sumatra and Pongo pygmaeus in Borneo. And currently, all 3 of them are listed as critically endangered by the red list commissioned by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, as all 3 species have undergone rapid population declines in recent decades. Forest loss and hunting are currently the major factors contributing to the decline of orangutans. While hunting for food seems still to be frequent in Borneo, orangutans also get killed when they get into conflict with humans in consequence of increasing habitat fragmentation due to logging, the expansion of industrial agriculture and forestry, mining, infrastructure development, and also forest fires. Their endangerment and appeal to humans make orangutans a popular flagship species of international conservation campaigns that often seek to raise awareness about broader environmentalist issues, such as the loss of tropical forests, endangered species, climate change, and ethical consumption. Orangutans falling victim to deforestation and forest fires have raised international attention about the loss of rainforests in Sumatra and Borneo and the impact of peat fires on the global climate. The fate of orangutans has also alarmed consumers in the global north to the environmental costs of palm oil, which is found in many foods, cosmetics, and also used as biofuels. Here is a German campaign, but the images you see, they are often used in different countries. It's the same images. What remains absent in Western anti-palm oil campaigns, however, are the voices of Indonesian palm oil smallholders who produce more than 1/3 of all Indonesian palm oil. Like other flagship species, orangutans thus work both as icon and catalyst for environmentalist ideas in general and global biodiversity conservation in particular. Such flagship species are able to mobilize moral, financial, and political support for the cause of conservation thanks to what is called non-human charisma. With their morphological and behavioral similarities to humans, orangutans evoke great affection, empathy, and care amongst Western people. Hannah, for instance, found that orangutans have a great effective presence in the lives of UK and US orangutan adopters who donate money in aid of an individual ape and receive regular updates about their condition and progress. These adopters displayed a photo of their adopted orangutan prominently in their home, often alongside family photos, avidly followed their progress via social media, and used a language of family, kinship, or spiritual connection to show their attachment to their adoptee. This ability to raise emotion and support makes orangutans a perfect funding tool for conservation organization. As both my Indonesian and Western conservation interlocutors agreed, quote, "The orangutan sells, at least in the global north. In Indonesia, things are very different as I will show you now. When I saw this image at Jakarta's airport, I was somehow a bit, surprised or confused, because it did completely not resonate with my own experience in the way people perceive orangutans in Indonesia, as I want to outline now. When I discussed the challenges of orangutan conservation with the manager of the Indonesian branch of one of the world's biggest orangutan conservation organizations, he explained, "Orangutans work well internationally, but they don't work here in Indonesia." What he meant was that the strategic mobilization of orangutans work well in the global north, as outlined before, but not in Indonesia, where most people have very different views of orangutans and expectations of what conservation should entail. In Indonesia, orangutan conservation is often not seen as an end in itself, but framed as a vehicle of national development, pembangunan, which is the leitmotif of positive socioeconomic change in Indonesia. The axiom that conservation should bring development pervades the work of orangutan conservation from the national to the local level and poses a big challenge for them, as they need to balance the discrepancy between such national views and international ideas and perceptions. Conservation organizations thus face the difficult task to meet the demands and expectations of international donors on the one hand, and need to find ways of working around and beyond the orangutan to respond to local perceptions, aspirations, and needs, whether in the engagement with government agencies, business stakeholders, or villagers like Yusuf, whose hopes and expectations of development are embedded in local norms and ideas of reciprocity. Let me now return to my conversation with Yusuf. Recall how Yusuf bemoaned how things had become sick since a conservation organization had begun to release orangutans in a national park nearby. "Why sick?" I asked my uncle. Yusuf began to explain his concerns in detail. Quote, "As you know, there are many ancestral village sites upriver. So when there will be more and more orangutans or fruits, our fruits there will certainly be eaten. There is no hope anymore that we will eat fruits as usual. That's the first thing." So here, for instance, you can see an ancestral village sites where the durian trees indicate previous ownership and settlement. That's the first thing. And the second thing, if orangutans already know where to find food, they will always return, and that's what makes people afraid. Usually the women go to the fields by themselves, but if things are like that, they won't dare anymore to go. Third, if orangutans discover a swidden field, they can finish the food stored in our field hut, stamp the paddy down, and the paddy is certainly destroyed. The fourth thing is that people are no longer allowed to hunt. And fifth, those mining for gold upriver can no longer look for gold there because of the patrols. This is certainly not the way to make people happy, but actually makes things more difficult." Yusuf concluded and asked once more, "What's the meaning of the release? What's actually the benefit of all these activities for us?" What can this conversation tell us about local people's engagement with orangutan conservation? I suggest that Yusuf's explanations reveal several important points about Bornean villages' relationship with orangutans and conservation more broadly. These are the perception of orangutans as something pretty normal, hal biasa, orangutans' unpredictable and harmful agency, the observation that conservation often has adverse impacts on local livelihoods, and the local expectation that conservation measures should bring benefits. In the following, I want to explore these aspects in more detail. Some indigenous groups in Borneo share special relations with orangutans and, for instance, recount myths about how orangutans taught their ancestors to deliver babies safely. Although also my interlocutors in Saipan and other villages in the area retell various myths about orangutans, for example, that orangutans turn into spiritual beings once they have died, the apes have hardly any sociocultural significance for these villages. Of little meaning and only rarely encountered, orangutans are generally absent from their everyday life. Like most rural Borneans, my acquaintances in this area see orangutans not as particularly special, but as one of many sentient non-human beings that, like other animals, plants, rivers, or rocks, possess particular traits and have the ability to act on humans and their well-being. What my acquaintances thus acknowledge and also fear is orangutan's strengths and predictable agencies, as remarked by Yusuf. In contrast to common popular Western portrayals of orangutans as gentle and peaceful, Bornean rural villages are well aware that orangutans have their own agencies that they execute in unforeseen ways. As they roam through the landscape in search for food and shelter, orangutans can eat fruits, damage crops, and destroy people's fields and equipment, which means a great loss for subsistence farmers like Yusuf. The likelihood of such human-ape encounters increases when orangutan habitat is destroyed or orangutans are released or translocated close to villages. Still, they happen relatively rarely compared to other, often unseen impacts that are not caused by orangutans themselves, but result from conservationist efforts to protect them. Orangutan conservation projects can bring rural people benefits such as jobs, education, infrastructure, or sometimes networks. Often, however, the protection of orangutan habitat and the release of orangutans close to villages lead to adverse socioeconomic impacts and conflicts over access to and ownership of land and forests. For the majority of people living with or alongside orangutans, using the resources of the environment is indispensable for making a living. Land is not only vital for the cultivation of upland rice and vegetables in these remote areas, but the most valuable asset that villages usually have. Here you can see the preparation of an upland swidden field where the men go before the women with the planting sticks, and then the women come thereafter to throw a few seeds of rice into these holes. That image was taken in 2013. As local currency, land serves as investment to cover education costs, provides a security in times of hardship, and is part of local pride wealth. Access to forests, moreover, enables people to engage in logging and small-scale gold mining, which are currently the most important income sources in the area. Moreover, hunting is a major source of protein for local people, unless they are Muslim. However, for Bornean villages, using the resources of the forest is as much an economic as a moral concern. For them, the surrounding forest is a social landscape that is sustained through everyday labor and imbued with histories of migration, kinship formation, and past and present mobility, as pointed out by Yusuf and seen in this map. In this map, which inhabitants of Saipan drew in 2013, to explain me the village's history of migration and thus the expansion of their customary rights. So their ancestral site is up here where you have the red here, and the village is further down, and it's 2 days of travel by boat going upriver here. So it's a huge territory. Based on their territorial understandings, the orangutans were thus not released in empty forests of a national park as claimed by state actors, but on their customary lands. Due to the existence of such parallel legal systems and poor land use planning in Borneo, such tensions between customary ways of engaging with the environment and framing access to and ownership over resources and state regulations that define these understandings and local livelihood activities as illegal are very common and actually often exacerbated when customary lands get protected for the sake of conservation. For rural Borneans, like my acquaintances in Saipan, orangutan conservation thus raises concrete material concerns about rights, access, ownership, justice, and benefit sharing, which brings me to the last point. Villages affected by orangutan conservation initiatives hope, although often not clearly articulated, that such schemes bring socioeconomic benefits for the community at large. Embedded in local guest-host relationships and ideas of reciprocity, local residents expect something in return for hosting the conservation project, and in the case of the release activities, also the rehabilitated orangutans. Local conservation organizations are also increasingly aware that they need to work beyond and around the orangutan in order to make conservation work on the ground. To involve local communities in their efforts, most organizations follow the standard model of international conservation that integrates conservation with community development. Community engagement involves a broad range of activities, from ecotourism over environmental education to the creation of sustainable livelihoods, as you can, for instance, see here, where people are trained in permaculture. And all these activities rarely deal with orangutans directly. Community development serves to build rapport with villagers and ideally bring socioeconomic benefits for local people. From a critical perspective, however, community development projects can also be seen as a means of legitimizing conservation efforts and forming so-called environmental subjects who care about orangutans and the environment in general. Because usually the aim of such initiatives is not merely to bring socioeconomic benefits for people, but to change local mindsets and environmental behavior by making the orangutan present in an immaterial sense. Conservation development projects rarely achieve their goals and have any long-lasting effects. Apart from lacking financial and human capacities, the short-termism of the project cycle in which community development activities operate prevents long-term commitments. Despite these structural issues, conservation staff tends to attribute the challenges they face to local people's mindset and unwillingness to engage. However, I want to suggest that the difficulties of such community conservation interactions are largely the result of different understandings and expectations about the modalities of their relationship. In their engagement with villages, community development staff frequently uses a seemingly political, neutral, but yet paternalistic language that, however, reminds very much of the Indonesian government development discourse. Conservation workers portray themselves as mere facilitators who help communities to develop, maju, and become independent citizens by, for example, helping them to identify their needs, train them in alternative farming methods, as in the case shown here, or teach them about local wildlife. By completing such community workshops, trainings, education, or whatever, conservation organizations see their part often fulfilled and hope that in exchange for these activities, villages will stop hunting, logging, mining, or other activities considered as destructive and care more about the forest and its wildlife, and the orangutan in particular. This is, however, not the way local people see such conservation, see conservation and its initiatives. It might be surprising, but rural Borneans see conservation projects just as one of the various outside forces next to palm oil plantations, mining corporations, or infrastructure development that have the ability to bring both positive and negative impacts. People's motivation to engage with these various actors, often at the same time, is not necessarily morally driven, but more by social and pragmatic considerations. People's engagement often results from their wish and also need to expand their social networks that might be beneficial at some point in time. For villagers, then, engaging in conservation development projects and conservation in general is foremost a way of creating long-term social relationships of mutual care with outsiders. In exchange for hosting the outsiders and participating in their activities, the villagers hope that these will help them to acquire goods, jobs, and facilities, all of which is locally known under the acronym development. However, given their short-termism and lack of money and personnel, community projects hardly ever meet these expectations. Community development workers are well aware of this and seek to avoid such expectations. When the conservation NGO that released the orangutans near Sapan introduced their community development program to the villagers, the staff deliberately called the planned activities seed capital modal awal and not help bantuan. Therewith, he sought to avoid expectations for long-term engagement, he told me during a later interview. During the meeting with the villagers, I asked how long their program would last. It would finish in 4 months, the young man explained, and quickly added that the funding would be extended if the donor evaluation worked out. Yusuf and his fellow villagers looked disappointed. This way, their hopes for development would certainly not materialize. And Yusuf's question, what the benefit of the release is for the villagers, remains yet to be answered. To conclude, I want to address what the figure of the orangutan as absent agent can tell us about the disparities, inequities, and imbalances within orangutan conservation and global conservation at large. The first thing is that the same thing can have very different meaning to different people. What is a unique species in need of protection for some is seen as something normal or even a pest by others. Neither can we assume that flagship species like the orangutan are seen as special by everyone, nor that these animals are benign, gentle, and peaceful, as often portrayed in conservation campaigns. So the second thing is that flagship species have their own agencies that they execute in unforeseen ways and that can cause harm and damage to people living alongside these species. This brings us to the third point. Even if flagship species like the orangutan are generally absent from people's everyday life, they can have a surprising impact on their lives thanks to the work of conservationists. often the protection of such species raises concrete material concerns for the people living alongside them, no matter whether their promotion works or not. The fourth point is that while the factors why conservation projects work or fail are highly complex, one aspect that I think needs more attention are the diverse understandings and expectations of the way conservation should work and what it should imply. While most conservation organizations devote their time and money on carrying out all kinds of activities, which serve as outputs in donor reports, villagers like my Bornean acquaintances can have a very different focus in their evaluation of conservation. They are much less interested in trainings, workshops, and the like, but rather hope for long-term relationships of mutual care and reciprocity. Apart from restricted resource access and loss of customary lands, one of the most widespread criticisms that local people have of orangutan conservation is that these organizations do not fulfill their part of their relationship in the way villagers think they should. People complain that conservation staff rarely engages with them in an informal way, like hanging out, drinking coffee, and all these things. And that staff only shows up for very short and rare visits. They also bemoan an insufficient involvement of villagers in their activities and lacking benefits for the community at large. All this leads them to frequently say that conservationists do not care about local people, but just about forests and wildlife. Taken together, these different points challenge the way international conservation works. Too often, the claims and concerns of international conservation are taken for granted. Yet, neither are these shared universals, nor is international conservation a political, neutral, and socially even process. Far from being a self-evident good, for villages like my acquaintances in Indonesian Borneo, conservation is a highly political project with unintended yet often invisible effects. All this raises thorny questions about whose interests conservation serves, whose right it protects, who it benefits, and how it could be carried out in more equitable ways, not only for the sake of local people like my acquaintances in Indonesian Borneo, but also for the sake of the orangutan itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Viola, for a really ethnographically rich and very thought-provoking, very powerful paper. And I hope others found it equally illuminating. What I suggest we do now, we've got about sort of 20 minutes. We've got some time for questions if people would like to ask them. We've also got some time for people to just chip in into a general discussion if you would like. We can just sort of see how things go because it's quite a small group here. But please feel free to just kind of turn on your cameras and just be around. So either type a question in the chat, which I'll have a look at, or raise your hand. And I think we've got a hand raised from Meredith.
Hello, thank you. Viola, oh my goodness, what a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. It's not a very nuanced question, but it's just a matter of clarification. I wondered why your uncle said that the women would now be fearful of going into the fields now that they knew orangutans were in the forest, because I thought that these apes were not really very rarely violent towards humans.
Yes, okay, thank you, Meredith. There is a sort of myth going around in Indonesian Borneo that orangutans can rape women, and and people often sort of come up with this, and I think that's where he is referring to, and people are actually very much afraid of encountering orangutans due to their strengths, although it happens not very often, but still they fear them. Yeah.
No, thank you.
Mhm.
I mean, maybe to add to that, I mean, there was some really quite groundbreaking research done by Cheryl Knott, who's a primatologist based in Boston, on wild orangutans in the West Kalimantan area. And some of the stuff she found in the 2000s sort of shook up prevailing notions or understandings of orangutans as quite peaceful creatures, because what she was finding actually was that, you know, they could also be quite violent and quite sort of vicious to each other. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question of different kinds of myths, you know, sort of local myths about what orangutans might do to women, but also conservation and kind of Western myths about orangutans being very peaceful creatures. I mean, maybe just to, you know, just to sort of, I guess, push the discussion a little bit further, Viola, I was just wondering if you've talked a lot about how people in these villages in central Kalimantan view orangutans, or, you know, don't really have a particular view on orangutans in many ways. And I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about how they think about other primates and other animals. You know, where do orangutans stand in this kind of broader non-human landscape that that people are living with?
Yeah. I think, yeah, people have different sort of relationships to different animals, and orangutans are seen as pretty nasty, I would say. I mean, Paul from POCOP, right? He had these very nice stories and explanations for that. So that orangutans, they even, you know, they pick your fruits even if they are not ripe, and that makes them particularly nasty. Whereas maybe other primates like gibbons, people enjoy their songs. You know, it's really nice in the morning to be woken up by the gibbons singing. So I think they rank maybe on a lower ladder, one could say, orangutans compared to gibbons. But that does not necessarily, at least in the places where I worked, yeah, prevent people also maybe to eat gibbons, yeah, or other primates. The proboscis monkeys is commonly hunted as well. So yeah, orangutans are also hunted or and get killed unless people have certain food taboos. So yeah, it's just a very different way of relating to these apes. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sort of, I guess it's this sense that, you know, that they're just part of this larger landscape of life in the forest, engage with in different ways, right? They could be pets, they could be prey, they
Yeah.
could be, you know, fellow, I don't know, fellow moral subjects in some ways.
Yeah, and if people keep a baby orangutan as a pet, that comes obviously to this question: what sort of care do we evaluate as proper care or improper care, right? Or if people want to adopt an orangutan to take it home because they understand this adoption as something physical and not a virtual engagement, then this also leads to the question, okay, is this an immoral care then? And what, yeah, is the care, is it a better care, a worse care? Yeah, so I think we tend to judge obviously these engagements from our own perspective, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because you sort of hear people, you know, you hear villagers in Borneo talking about how they love animals too, you know, they care for this and that animal too, but then they get really confused when conservationists sometimes come in and say, no, that's not proper care, that's not okay because you're hurting them or whatever, or you're being cruel to them. It's a really interesting question of how you judge what a proper relationship to an animal is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, maybe just a comment to add to the conversation. That I came across this book by Chilik Ribut the other day, who is this national hero who's also Dayak and the first governor of Central Kalimantan, and he also wrote a lot about the history of his of his island. And so there's a lot of animals in there, in animals in traditional culture, including many types of birds. But when he talks about traditional culture, he doesn't talk about orangutans, but they do appear in a section about ways of being in the forest, where he talks about, like, if you see many fruit trees, then this is probably like an old Sweden site. So you're near a village, so take that into account. But also like ways to keep away aggressive animals. And he says, like, you have to burn something spicy. I think it might just be chili peppers or something, and that is known to keep away bears and orangutans. So I think it's funny that orangutans are like lumped together with bears as in the aggressive animals section.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, yeah, and people, I came across in this village where I worked that someone kept a copy of this book actually as well, where Chilik River is also talking about, adat, the customary law, and they sort of refer to it like, oh, it's not written in the book, so then it's not, adat. So I think that would also be interesting to see, to what extent they sort of check what is written down in the book and how they then should engage with this animal or not. Yeah, yeah, but
I guess it's a comment. I personally found the image of the tied up bush pig very distressing, because as far as I could see, that creature was still alive, and the places beneath the places beneath where they'd been tied were bright red and clearly very painful for the creature. And it made me think about the kinds of hypocrisies that we have, in this culture that we're all part of, in terms of speciesism and in terms of some non-humans being appropriate to eat, some being a danger, some being the creatures that we love, that are our pets. And one of the things I really loved about your talk was how it was completely non-judgmental in terms of, for example, someone from a different perspective could point, could perhaps say, oh, these villages are in some way hypocritical in terms of, the attitudes they have towards different non-humans. But of course, they're no more hypocritical than we are. So, yeah, I suppose it's just more of a kind of wider comment about speciesism and different sorts of attitudes humans have towards non-humans, especially in terms of which ones are our friends and which ones are not, and the ways that varies across cultures. It's really just a comment. I loved how what you did was point out that, when people from the global north step in to try and impose their ideas of what those appropriate relationships are, it generally doesn't work. So, or not in the way it was meant to. So, yeah, just a comment, and I liked that, and it made me, think even more about our own culture and our attitudes towards different sorts of non-humans.
yes, thank you, Meredith. A friend of mine who's from the area and who's highly educated, she asked the question, why are they not using an other animal that has much more, iconic power for people here to sort of bring their method through? You know, why are they using the orangutan? And obviously the orangutan works internationally and that brings the money, but locally it doesn't work. So why don't they use the hornbill, she asked. You know, that has very sort of cultural meaning for people. And I think that's the sort of things that conservation, and they are, I think conservationists are aware of the problems they face, but also donors need to be more aware of this, what works. I mean, otherwise you just spend all this money, and yeah, the achievement is maybe not as big as you would like it to be, you know, to account for alternative forms of engagement with villagers, for instance, instead of one activity after the other. You know, think of how can we create longer term engagements with people? How can we maybe incorporate more these iconic, locally iconic species and still achieve an international message? You know, I think people here, donors also have a big role in creating a more flexible space for conservation organizations who sort of struggle to balance these discrepancies. Yeah.
And actually, this links very nicely to a question that Anne has just asked in the chat about the short-term nature of conservation projects and the possibility for more joined-up thinking. Anne, I could read it out, Anne, or would you like to just...
Okay, so really, really interesting. Just a bit of context, my daughter went out to Borneo about 5 years ago on a project with school for about 6 to 10 weeks. I think she was out there. So I shall definitely be sending her the video of this talk, because I'm sure she'll be really interested. So I suppose thinking about that and thinking about the various different efforts we make in the north, if you like, to go out to these remote places. And you mentioned about the short-term nature that the local people feel. You know, people come in, they do something, they go away, and then maybe life goes back to normal because it hasn't really made that much difference to them, because they don't buy into it, they don't understand. So should we take responsibility to have a more joined up approach to how we interact and the various different projects we use when we go out there?
I guess so. If I understand your questions correctly, I mean, even if, for instance, personally, yeah, if I'm an anthropologist, I'm used to very long-term field work, and if I go to a place for just a very short visit, I'm not comfortable with it, yeah, to be honest, because I feel I don't understand the place, I don't have a relationship with these people, and I just go there and sort of extract things from people, and it doesn't make me yeah, very happy, so to say. And so I think conservation organizations, they try to establish longer term commitments, but as they operate in these project cycles, and this is not only specific for conservation, but also all the development projects, you have the same thing. You have a 2-year project. First, you need to you need to get to know the place. I mean, that's very little time, and we have it in academia, the same thing. It's not restricted to conservation. So I think in general, this is a systemic question, yeah, that we need to address. And it's not, if you want to build something with a long-term sustainability in any field, then you need to be ready to invest more money and time, and rather than have these short-term engagements.
Yes, big. Yeah, you can't answer that in sort of a 5-minute slot. So no, it's a big problem. Thank you. It's really, really interesting.
Okay, I'm aware that we're reaching the end of our time slot. If anybody wants to add one final quick question or comment, you're very, very welcome to, but it will have to literally take 20 seconds. Last call for questions, comments, anything?
Yeah, maybe a quick question, unless Meredith wanted to ask something. It was just interesting that you said that they see conservationists similar to other outside influences, but I wonder, despite the similarities, how they also see maybe differences in the same way that they might see differences between, for example, a palm oil operation and a logging company, you know, where the one destroys the forest and the other keeps some forest cover intact. Like, how do conservationists differ from the other influences? Maybe?
That's a tricky one, you know, because obviously you can sort of come with this sort of moral perspective and say, oh yeah, the one protecting the forest, but then local people may ask, yeah, but what is the benefit for all of this if the forest then is protected and we no longer can access it and use its resources? I mean, I heard voices and there are different voices, obviously, but some people were actually saying, like, or sometimes say, well, conservation is worse than, for instance, the logging that you had throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s in this area, where people sort of could really benefit from the forest and which they considered as theirs. In the with palm oil, I think people don't agree with all the chopping down of the forest, but at least palm oil brings them jobs and a stable income. So I think it's always, you have a sort of, and conservation initiatives, if they work properly and people find jobs and education and networks, they also benefit from it. So it's always a sort of a complex two-way engagement with these different actors. Yeah, but obviously for a conservation project, they have this short-termism, whereas a palm oil company, it stays at least for 25 years. That's also another thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Viola. And on that note, I think we're going to have to finish this session now. So I'd just like to say a very big thank you to everyone for joining us, and just to remind you that there are many other really interesting talks and events and stuff, including, a talk about apocalyptic narratives, brilliant, at 11:30 later on, as well as a whole other week next week and a whole other week the week after that on various other themes. So for more information, please look at the Research Festival website. But before closing, I'd just like to say another big thank you to Viola for sharing some of her really fascinating insights with us. So thank you, Viola, and thank you, everyone.